Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Eliza Henry-Jones is a Victorian author, freelance writer, PH candidate and flower farmer whose previous novels have been listed for multiple literary awards. Her work has been published in a variety of places, including The Guardian, Country Style and The Age, amongst others. In 2017, a trip to the remote Orkney Islands of Scotland highlighted Eliza's preoccupation with hauntings and the interplay between places and traumatic events. This in turn inspired her latest novel. Called Salt and Skin, published by Ultimo Press, Eliza has drawn on her experience of the Orkney Islands and penned an evocative novel steeped in history and folklore. It's a book that explores love and family, grief and trauma, and the way past hurts can continue to affect the present. An utterly mesmerising read that I was hard-pressed to put down, and I'm delighted to be able to chat with Eliza about her novel on the podcast today. Welcome, Eliza.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure. And my goodness, what a stunning novel. I wanted to say congratulations. And how are you feeling about its publication?
Kind of astonished. It felt right from the start like such a huge story and such an intimidating story. So actually seeing it out there in the world as a book that people are reading and engaging with is just such an astonishing gift. I didn't think I'd get to this point.
Yeah, I think you described it absolutely perfectly. It is a huge story. And as I said before we started recording, so multi-layered. There's so much going on in it. But I think the overall effect is to create a really rich and nuanced story that I thoroughly enjoyed. But Eliza, I was wondering if you could tell me when it was that you first felt the spark of inspiration that led to you writing this novel.
I went on a trip to the Orkney Islands back in 2017, so quite a while ago now. And it was a trip that I took without my laptop or my phone or even a notebook because I just wanted to have a break from writing and work, which is, kind of shot myself in the foot a little bit there. But we were there coming into winter and it was very windy, very cold. The days were quite short and there weren't a lot of other tourists there. So we had quite a few of the tours to ourselves, which was pretty cool. And one of the things we did while we were there was go on a tour of St Agnes Cathedral, which is the inspiration behind the kirk, the church in Salt and Skin. And it's a very, very old kirk. They began constructing it in 1137. And when we were there, we saw the hole in the wall where they used to imprison those that were accused of witchcraft. And a majority of them on the Orkney Islands are women, 90% of them are women. And something about seeing that dungeon, it's just this hole in the wall. You need a ladder to get up there. The floor's shaped like the bottom of a champagne bottle, so people in there couldn't even rest when they were in there. And they also had the hangman's ladder there. And something about seeing that dungeon and seeing this ladder that these convicted witches would have been forced to climb before they were hanged just really got under my skin, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And my other novels, even though they deal thematically with sort of similar things, grief and trauma and family and connection, they're also very much in my comfort zone. They're set in Australia, they're set in areas that I'm very familiar with, and writing this story that drew on, real historical records and delved into this culture that I was sort of only peripherally aware of just felt, like I said before, just felt enormous.
And so I wondered, when you started thinking that you might like to write Salt and Skin, what did you do next? Did you embark on research, or did you sit and sketch out the bones of what would become the story and then fill it out with research?
Well, it sort of felt like such an intimidating story that I put it off and just focused on other things for a couple of years. And it wasn't until my son was a newborn, I was incredibly sleep deprived, he was a very screamy baby, that I actually began to really actively think about how I would construct this story, how I would actually write it, what I wanted to write. And when you've got like a very screaming newborn baby that wouldn't go down in his cot, I didn't actually have an arm free to type. So I just spent all this time just thinking about this story and thinking about the characters and thinking about the arcs and the place and how I'd evoke it. And in the end, it just felt so enormous. I spent so much time thinking about it that I actually couldn't work out where to start. And I ended up actually opening the notes app of my phone and just writing it in verse. And I'm not a poet at all. I read it, but I'm not good at writing it. I don't understand it very well. And I wrote about 4,000 words, it just flowed out. And that was how I found my way into the story. And interestingly, some of those sections of verse have actually ended up in the final copy. So the very, very final scene in Salt and Skin is almost word for word the final little bit of verse that I wrote when I was sleep deprived with my phone, baby in one hand, phone in the other. And it's been really interesting sort of watching the rest of the story develop around these scattered sections that have lasted while, the editing process was enormous for this book. I ended up throwing out 150,000 words from an 100,000 word book. And so just watching these huge seismic changes happening around these little bits that just endured and survived was quite fascinating creatively, I found.
Oh my goodness, 100,000, more than 100. What did you say? 150,000 words?
150, yeah.
God, that's a whole book in itself. A
Yeah.
book plus. My gosh. Well, what tenacity to be able to work through all of that and end up with this delightful and utterly evocative novel. So well done, you.
Thank you.
For the benefit of those who haven't yet read your book, can you tell me a little bit more about the story?
Absolutely. So basically the story is about Luda Manigan, who is newly widowed, and she and her two teenage children move from their drought-stricken farm in Australia to a collection of remote Scottish islands. And Luda is moving, because she's just completely been bowled over by losing her husband and she just runs. But more practically, she is moving because she has been hired to document the climate crisis on this collection of islands. And that is something that she had done really successfully back home in Australia. And shortly after arriving on these islands, she takes a photo of a really horrific event and sells it to the tabloids. And for her, it's around, this is her job. She's raising awareness around climate change, but the nature of the image is very sensitive and horrific, and the local community are absolutely horrified that it's invaded their, she's just popped up out of nowhere and put this incredibly challenging photo out into the world. And that has implications for her and her kids. And she kind of delves into the witch hunts, the history of the witch hunts. And while they're based on the witch trials that actually did occur on the Orkney Islands in the 17th century, I have taken a lot of liberties, which is why I don't mention that it's set in Orkney in the book, because I have deviated wildly. And the two children kind of respond to that ostracization by making friends with Theo. And Theo is a foundling boy who washed up on one of the little islands when he was about 6, and he has no recollection of where he was before that, and he has webbing between his fingers. And a lot of the people on these islands think that he may be a selkie. It's a seal person, so someone that's a seal when they're in the sea and then they come up onto land and shed their skin. And his relationship with the two Manigan children kind of evolves and grows. There's a bit of romance there, which made me quite happy. And it's the different ways that they engage and connect with the folklore and the ghosts and the stories of the islands.
For those who may not know, what's a foundling child?
So just a child, I've never looked up the specific definition, but just a child that just kind of turns up and requires a home and care and nurturing. Theo was taken in by a local woman called Iris, who was very actively involved with the church. And he's probably my favorite character, I think, in the book.
He's a pretty special character. And I kind of want to get on to the romance a little bit later, because I think this makes a really fabulous thread to this book. But as you said, witch hunts and witch trials form a compelling thread to this novel, along with whales and selkies. I wondered if you could tell me more about that and why you wanted to explore these themes in the context of this story.
I wanted to explore, I suppose, how humans navigate nature and animals and landscape, and how we do that in the context of climate change. And I was kind of fascinated by the ways that selkies inhabit this liminal space between the natural world and the human world, and what that means and how that can be reimagined into contemporary fiction. And whales, I read Fathoms by Rebecca Giggs, which is a nonfiction work about whales, and it's just absolutely bowled me over. I loved it. And I don't know, it's just something so fascinating about whales. They were actually a bigger part. They're sort of a pretty, they're definitely in the book, but they're a more minor thread than they were in earlier drafts. They were a bigger part of it, but I kind of had to pare them back a little bit because I couldn't jam everything else in that I wanted to jam in.
It's fair to say that Luda, Darcy, and Min are all scarred by their pasts, both physically and emotionally. And scarring is something that preoccupies the inhabitants of Shawnee, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And Shawnee is a little tiny island off an island. So it can only be accessed via a causeway at low tide. Otherwise, you've kind of got to wade across the sand. And on this island, there's something about the light, and some people think it's the witch's curse or something about how the light reflects off the water. But whatever the reason, some people, when they're on this island, can actually see every single scar that a person has sustained to their skin. So it's kind of like these luminous tracks on people's skin, and only some people can see them, and those that can't see them kind of dismiss them. And it's kind of this strange thing that a lot of people are aware of and experience, but it's kind of not talked about as much as you would imagine something like that would be spoken about. And I was interested in what it would be like to have your story netted across your skin like that in such a public way, and how you'd navigate that, and what it would mean if only some people can see them. How does a community respond to that sort of thing? And I also wanted to use them to kind of, again, play with that divide between human and place, and nature. So I've got the whales also have the scars on their skin when they wash up on the island. I had a lot of fun with that thread, actually. I had a lot of fun with all the threads. I mean, the book was so hard for me to write, and I kept thinking I just wasn't up to the challenge. But I did enjoy it a lot at the same time.
As you mentioned earlier, climate change is another rather powerful thread that runs through this novel. Luda is on the island to highlight the effects of climate change, and soon enough, her daughter Min is actively trying to do something about it by collecting rubbish from the ocean and almost shaming locals into understanding that we're all responsible for this event. And you explore the effects of drought and erosion on the landscape, and consequently on the psyche of the people who inhabit these environments. So I wanted to ask you, was this something you specifically wanted to explore, or was it something that came out of your research or your experiences as a flower farmer that led you to include this in the novel?
I'm glad you mentioned the flower farming. We were talking about this before we started recording. I have a little flower farm that I run with my cousin, and we also grow a lot of our own food. So we've got like orchards and veggie patches and that sort of thing. It's all very wholesome. But one of the things that I've been really struck by since moving here and being so up close and personal with like the cycling of the seasons and weather patterns and that sort of thing is how tiny shifts have huge implications. Like last November, we had a really wet, cold weekend, and I think hundreds of hives just died because it was the wrong time of year to have that kind of weather, and they were sort of building up. It's a time of the year when they're really building up the hives. There's a really large bee population, versus winter when they boot out all the drones and they sort of lock themselves down and they can weather that sort of cold. But things like that, and then they weren't in a position to then pollinate our orchards, so we had a lower fruit yield that year. And being confronted with you know, a microcosm of climate change, and just seeing the rippling effects on a really small scale has made me acutely aware of climate change. And something about, being on the Orkney Islands and seeing the ways that these islands are being impacted by climate change, and the fact that Australia and Orkney are both at the forefront of climate change events, but in very different ways. Orkney, it's erosion, it's king tides, it's, some of the smaller islands are actually, there's one Sandy that's being split in two just with, rising sea levels and erosion. Like this island is now two islands. And I was interested in the ways that these places are kind of very elementally different, but the communities are still impacted in a kind of a similar way. And I think it can be hard to strike a balance in a way, because I wanted to explore climate change, but I know, I don't like being hit over the head with it when I read fiction. It's not why I pick up a book. So I was very mindful and cautious around keeping it kind of a little bit in the background. Like, it informs a lot of things, but I tried not to hit anyone over the head with it as an issue in the book.
Luda, she was a slightly frustrating character, I have to admit. She seemed so wrapped up in her own grief and loss that she really didn't see her children were suffering too. More than suffering the loss of their father, they were holding on to deep trauma, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. There's these, two children that have been ripped, they've lost their father, they've been ripped away from everything that's familiar to them, and their mother is just so fixated on her work that she doesn't even recognize that they're grieving, really. And there's this added thread. So I mentioned earlier that Luda took a photo shortly after arriving on the islands, and she's actually done it before. So one of the reasons her efforts around raising awareness for climate change back in Australia was so successful was because she managed to capture a photo of her son lying on this cracked, dried out dam bed, looking completely anguished and just grief stricken. And she felt like he was feeling grief stricken about the drought and the impact it was having on the land and the animals and the community. And she published that without telling him, and that image became a rallying point for the climate events that were happening in that part of Australia. And in my head, I had, for Black Saturday, there was that, Sam the koala, there was that photo of the firefighter giving the water to the koala, and that kind of became the face of that emergency, that, devastating event. And I feel like almost, we've just got these rolling crises now, and we almost don't have that same kind of one focal image, because it's just this ongoing horrible thing. But I was interested in the way that, a single image can kind of become a rallying point. So she took that photo, and Darcy is still furious about her taking that photo, and it has completely undermined the relationship that he has with his mother. And what got me thinking about that is the work of photographer Sally Mann. And she's an incredibly well-renowned photographer in America. And in the 1980s, she took a series of incredibly intimate, graphic, explicit photos of her three children. And they are, technically they are masterpieces, like they are beautiful images, but they are confronting. There's photos of them, a lot of the photos, they're naked, there's close-ups of their genitals, there's photos of them, bleeding and crying after they've run into a door frame, there's photos of them on a mattress that they've urinated on in their sleep. They're confronting images. And I read a long form essay about her, and I was just so struck by, how as a parent do you decide what goes into the public space of your child? What of your child? What of their story? What of the images you've taken of them? How do you navigate that? And who protects the rights of the child when it's the parent transgressing those boundaries? Is something like climate change enough to justify a parent betraying their child the way that Luda has betrayed Darcy by putting that image out without any consultation? Is something being beautiful enough? Does anything justify it? So I don't know that I have any answers there, but that was sort of one of the key things that I wanted to explore in the novel.
And I think I get the sense from Darcy that not only is he angry that Luda published the photo without asking him, because I sense that he would have said no anyway. But he's so angry with her that she didn't even ask why he was there.
Yes. And she made that assumption that he was upset about, climate change impacts. But as the story unfolds, you become increasingly aware that actually he was reacting to something else and that something really terrible has happened to him.
Were you able to draw on your grief and trauma counselling qualifications to get inside of the head of each of these characters?
Absolutely. I'm so grateful that I studied psych and grief and trauma counselling and had that clinical experience, because I think it really changed how I look at things and how I understand things. And I mean, I hope it comes through in my writing. But one of the things I really wanted to explore in it, that my studies really, really informed, was this thing that happens in fiction a lot. And I've talked about this a lot over the last few weeks, and I've done it in my other books, but often, in fiction, you'll have this character behaving in a certain way, and there'll just be this kind of backstory dangled that that something really awful has happened to this character. You have this build up, and most people, you want to keep reading because you want to know what's happened to them. You want to know why they are the way they are, and you have this build up and to this moment of climax and catharsis where this character finally is able to articulate what they've been through to another character. And it's this moment of them being seen and nurtured and the rest of their life starting. And in my experience clinically and looking at literature and everything else, for a lot of people, that doesn't happen. People don't necessarily have the words to articulate what they've been through, even to themselves, let alone being able to pull it into a story to tell someone else. And I wanted to have a character in this book that had been through something horrific that he never actually tells anyone about. And you as the reader can kind of piece together what has happened to him. And there's this awareness as the story progresses of other characters realizing what he's been through, but it's never articulated. And that was really important for me. That's probably the biggest way that my qualifications kind of fed into the story, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think you absolutely lead readers to the conclusion of what has actually happened. But yeah, there is no catharsis and no explicit instruction about what has actually happened. It's just, it's just these little vignettes, very like glimpses. I think you've done that incredibly well. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I labored over those little snippets of flashback because I wanted it to kind of communicate it clearly, but be really, really subtle and just taking, a sentence out and tweaking a word. And I just labored over them.
As you mentioned earlier, there is a really surprising thread in this book. There's so much going on, but I think at the heart of it lies a really beautiful love story between Darcy and Theo. Theo is the foundling child, as you mentioned, who longs to know his history and where he came from. His trauma and hurts are public fodder. Then there's Darcy, the brilliant outsider who's hiding a terrible secret and doesn't want anyone to see his trauma. So I wondered, tell me how you came to be writing each of these characters and where did your inspiration come from?
They just kind of presented themselves. And Darcy in particular, he just was so fully formed in my head. And he probably required the least amount of editing as the story progressed and I got to know the characters more. I mean, it can be such subtle things. You'll be rereading your manuscript after years of working on it, and you'll be like, actually no, this phrase that this character's used, that's not quite right, and you'll just tweak a word, or it'll be something they notice when they walk down the street. And there was of course some tweaking, and I added and took scenes out, but fundamentally he was just a lot more developed early on. Theo evolved a lot more. It took me much longer to sort of get to know him and work out what his deal was and how he interacted with the world and the people in it and the animals and the islands themselves. And I didn't set out to write a sort of romantic love story. I knew I wanted to have love, and love is probably the main thread in this novel, even though it sounds quite dark when you talk about it, but there is a lot of warmth and humor and levity in it, I think. And when I started writing Darcy and Theo, they had such chemistry and they just fit together so beautifully because, like you said, Theo's trauma and, he's sort of like this global figure and everyone's wondering why he's washed up and where he's come from. And Darcy, in a way, is too, but, he has had this, horrific thing happen to him that is just completely locked away. And, on another level, Darcy's childhood has been documented so minutely. There's photos of every moment of his life almost, because, Luda's always just been so fascinated by photography, whereas, Theo washed up and he has it's just blank before he was 6. So I was interested in the ways that they could help each other grow and connect, and it's kind of funny because they have these moments where they're almost at the same place, but then one of them will kind of deviate and sort of nosedive and have issues, and it's definitely a slow burn.
So not only do you explore the issue of climate change in the context of the fictional island of Shawnee, but you bring this remote place alive. The ice cold water, the blustering wind, the salt from the sea. It's such a visceral imagining of this place, and it's a character as much as any of the others. So I wanted to ask you, Eliza, how important was creating a sense of place to you while writing this novel?
It makes my heart so happy to hear you describe it as almost being a character in the novel, because that's what I was really trying hard to achieve in it. And I mean, writing this novel was wild because most of it was written during lockdown, and I couldn't even get to Port Phillip Bay and paddle my pale little feet in the water there. I couldn't get to any form of beach. I was landlocked while I was writing it. And in a way, I think it kind of lent a dreamy quality to the way I evoked the islands that may have been quite different, I think, if I had, as I had planned to be, back on the Orkney Islands when I was writing most of it. I got a grant, but unfortunately I was unable to get there with COVID and everything. So yeah, I'm always really delighted to hear that, the landscape has kind of ended up evolving into something that was complex and active in the story, because yeah, it was a strange thing to write it so far away from water.
Eliza, if there was one thing you'd like readers to take away from Salt and Skin, what would it be?
I actually don't have one thing. There's so many different threads in this novel. I find it kind of hard to answer that question. I mean, I think what I would love broadly is for just something in the story to resonate with readers and for them to remember the story after they finish it, whatever the reason may be. Hopefully not for terrible reasons. But yeah, I'd love it to be remembered. I don't have anything more specific than that, I don't think.
Now, Salt and Skin isn't your first novel, as you've mentioned and as I've mentioned. So I wondered, given all of your experiences, if you had any tips for other authors listening to this podcast today, or writers, I should say.
I think my main piece of advice would be doing everything you can to cultivate and preserve the joy of writing, because I think the industry is, it's unpredictable and it can be challenging as someone who's introverted to have your work suddenly out in the world being read and responded to, even though it's an absolute gift at the same time. So I think just loving what you're doing, and that doesn't mean it's not hard or, it's not frustrating or infuriating, but I think engaging with issues that challenge you or excite you or, just engage you in some way is so important, because fundamentally, that's why we do it, right? Like we love stories, we love reading them, we love writing them. And I think just prioritizing that is so important.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Eliza, are you working on something else at the moment?
My thesis, which I have just sent to my supervisors. I'm hoping to submit it very soon. But yeah, Salt and Skin was actually, I turned it into a creative writing. Well, it's creative writing PhD. So I've been working on the exegesis. Book-wise, I've got a couple of things. So I'm working on something that was heavily inspired by my time at the Australian Institute of Marine Science up in Townsville. I did a residency there earlier this year. And I'm also really fascinated by the bog bodies in Ireland. So I've been doing some research into the bog bodies, but often I'll have a few kind of stories on the go at the same time. Once my thesis is done, on to the next book.
Eliza, I absolutely loved this novel. I've long had a fascination with Scotland and its history, and I foresee a visit to the Orkney Islands in my future now as a result of reading Salt and Skin. Thank you for a beautiful read and for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.